Thank you, Cheryl. So today marks our last sermon in this series on spiritual rhythms, talking about the movements of God's Spirit and the ways that we can live in rhythm or in step with God. And today we're going to be talking about giving and receiving. And when I was in seminary, I had the opportunity to take a class on Henry Nouwen. Some of you may have read some of his books. He was a Dutch priest. He was a professor at Duke University and felt called by God to leave this prestigious institution in his position. And he went and he lived in community with people with various forms of disabilities and cared for them. He, for a number of years, was with a man named Adam, who was confined to a wheelchair, was nonverbal, and Henry Nouwen lived with him and cared for him and was kind of like a priest for him and for this community. And Henry Nouwen wrote a lot about the spiritual life. He has numerous books. If you've not read anything by Henry Nouwen, I highly recommend you read some of his literature. He's able to take these deep, complex things and distill them in very succinct and powerful ways. One of the things I appreciate in his writings is he wrote a lot about the spiritual life. And oftentimes when we think about the spiritual life or our spiritual growth, we tend to think of it or conceive of it in terms of like a ladder or maybe climbing a mountain. So we progress from one stage to the next. We move forward or we move upwards until we attain a level of spirituality that we long for. Eric Fowler is a famous psychologist. He talked about the stages of faith. There's 6 stages, and we often think if you go from 1 to 2 to 2 to 3, 3 to 4, all the way, and your goal is to get to that final stage. Well, Henry Nouwen conceived of the spiritual life in actually a little bit of a different way. He conceived of the spiritual life not as progressing upwards or to a peak, but actually as movement between 2 poles. So imagine, if you can see here, there's 2 poles on this tent, and that in the spiritual life, rather than moving upwards, that we move between 2 realities that are often in contrast. And you never actually arrive, but you, almost like a pendulum, swing back and forth between these 2 realities. So for instance, there are kind of the 2 poles of, let's say, solitude and community. And there may be a time in our lives, in our spiritual life, where we have to lean into community, that we have to learn to love others well and to give and to take and to learn what it is to put others' needs before our own. But sometimes if we lean too far into community, what ends up happening is that we look to the people around us to meet our own inner needs, or being with people actually becomes a cover for us actually addressing our deep inner needs to be loved and known by God. And so what Henry Nouwen says is that when we lean too far into community, the antidote actually is to step away and to spend time in solitude, to recognize that apart from people, apart from activity, apart from busyness, that we are deeply loved, beloved of God, and that there's nothing that can change that. But what can happen is that if we spend too much time in solitude, we begin to become disconnected from people, that we weren't made to be alone, that we were made to be in community. And so rather than spending all of our time in solitude, we have to then move towards community. And so Henry Nouwen said that the spiritual life is this constant movement between 2 different poles. And you can choose whatever the 2 are. There's numerous facets or realities that we find ourselves in. So rather than progressing or arriving at a place, the spiritual life is learning to kind of move between these realities and to find the rhythm that is involved in moving from solitude to community. And there's numerous other kind of poles that we can think of in the spiritual life. I want you to hold on to that image this morning because we're going to come back to it. But our text this morning is from the book of Proverbs. And I want to give a quick word about Proverbs. When I was growing up, I was told that Proverbs is the book of wisdom, which it is. All of these aphorisms and sayings are gateways to wisdom. And I was told that if I memorized Proverbs, then I would be wise. But I think that's a little bit of a misunderstanding. There's all these Proverbs, and if we memorize them, we would have the beginning of wisdom. But wisdom is not just in knowing the Proverbs, it's in knowing when to apply the Proverbs. So Proverbs wisdom is situational. It's not just knowing information, but it's about knowing when to apply it. When is the proper situation? How do I step into this certain reality? And what proverb is required for this? So it's important to memorize the Proverbs, I would say, and to know these. But wisdom is not just in the knowing, wisdom is in the doing. It's in the applying of the Proverbs. And our Proverbs today speak to the logic of generosity. So the first proverb, some give freely, yet grow all the richer. Others withhold what is due and only suffer want. The teaching here is a bit counterintuitive. We think we tend to live with a scarcity mindset. We only have a limited amount of things, and if you give things away, you have less. So if I have 10 apples and I give 5 of them away, I have less than what I began with. But here the proverb is saying that some who give freely grow all the richer. So that those who give actually find that they have more. The logic is like that of a farmer. You see, if a farmer has seeds, if they give those seeds away to the soil, if they throw them and scatter them, they actually have a greater harvest. But a farmer who holds on to their seeds, actually at the end of the day is going to have less than they began with, because the seeds don't bear fruits. They don't bear fruit, they don't grow, they don't produce a harvest. And so the logic of generosity is like that of a farmer. At times we want to hold on to what we have, to harness and to maintain, for fear that if we give things away, we are going to be lacking and left wanting at the end. But what we are told here is that that's not actually the logic or the economy of generosity. That when we give, we actually discover that we receive so much more. That when we give, when we are generous with not just our money, but our time, our resources, our own gifts, we share ourselves with others, we discover more. Something my grandfather told me that has stuck with me is he said, when you give yourself away, you actually get bigger. When you give yourself, you actually grow all the richer, is what we are told here in Proverbs. And so there's a logic to generosity, that when you give, you receive that much more. And when you withhold, you end up with less. So we are invited into a lifestyle of generosity and giving. The second proverb reinforces the first. A generous person will be enriched, and the one who gives water will get water. And we have to think of these proverbs beyond just money. When we talk about generosity, we often think of terms of money, cash, gold, whatever it is, whatever we try to use to buy. We think of that we need to give that away. And the proverb absolutely speaks to giving and being generous with money, but it's much more than that. It is our resources, ourselves, our times, whatever gifts God gives us, which the gifts that God gives us are bountiful. We are called to be generous with those things. And so the logic here, the teaching, is that giving is a spiritual rhythm. That when we give, we actually grow in humility, right? Because we receive these gifts from God and we give them and we extend them to others. We realize and come to learn that life is not all about us, that there's beauty in giving to other people. And that we see that when we give, that the joy that can be extended, the peace, the life and love that can be multiplied. And in doing so, we realize that life is not all about us. We grow in humility. We come to see that others are just as important and valuable as us. So in all situations, no matter what, we always give. But that's not always true. Maybe you've met people in your life who are always giving, but the giving comes from a place not actually of humility, but of scorekeeping. Have you ever met someone who you give to them and then they have to give more back to you, right? You give them a gift and then they give you a bigger gift, who are living with a scorekeeping mentality in mind, that they never actually want to be in debt to someone else, but always be the one giving, always be the one extending, always be the one to give to others. And we often use the teaching of Christ, right? It is more blessed to give than to receive. And so we think we always have to be the ones giving. And so if anyone gives to us, we are now in debt. And so we must, to climb out of that debt, give more. I see some of you nodding your heads that you know people like that. If they're here, don't look at them. Just keep that to yourself. But giving can actually become a source of pride. That when we continually give, when we can only be ones who are giving, when we constantly have to be the ones giving to others, it actually sets us up in a position of power. That others need us. And we're looking to the act of generosity or the act of giving to meet some internal need. So we keep giving and giving and giving, never wanting to be in debt, and it actually sets us above others. We can become resentful of others because we're constantly giving and no one gives like us. This is where I find Henry Nouwen's framework is helpful. Because if we constantly are giving and giving and giving, we become imbalanced. And the two poles or two realities that we move in and out of in the spiritual life are giving and receiving. We see that in the text. The one who gives water will get water. There is giving and there is receiving. If we are going to be people who are generous, we also have to be people who are willing to receive. If everyone is giving, there's no one to actually receive. There is a movement in the spiritual life, a rhythm, that there are times when we are called to giving and generosity so that we can grow in humility. But if we stay in that place of giving and generosity, our giving soon becomes a weapon by which we lord it over others, or that we hold power over others, or the ways that we prop up our own sense of pride. And so we have to then move to a place of receiving, of being dependent upon someone else, and recognizing that we need other people, and having a posture of being able to receive. Because if we can receive from someone else, there's humility in that. To allow someone else to bless us, to give to us, and not feel like we have to repay, not keep a mental scorecard of how much we owe them or how much they owe us. And if we spend too long in this place of receiving, in a sense, we grow spiritually fat. We just keep getting and getting, and then we think, this is what I am due. I am an amazing human being. Give me more things. I need more. And so when we get to that place, we have to move to a place of giving. There is a spiritual rhythm where we give and we receive. And we give and we receive. And we learn that dance, that the wisdom is not always giving or always receiving, but Is this a situation in which I am called to generosity? Or is this a situation where I am called to receive and be dependent? A lot of this really came to light for me. This is going to sound lame. It was in reading a book review. I didn't actually read the book. I read someone else who wrote a review of the book, and their book review was really meaningful. I want to read the book. I haven't read the book yet, but the book review is really good. So I can't speak to the book, but I can speak to the book review. There's a book called Crippled Grace. It's written by a man named Shane Clifton. He is a theologian and a philosopher, and he suffered an accident and broke his spine. And so overnight went from a very active man in his 30s to a quadriplegic, confined to a wheelchair, unable to care for his own self, to even attend to his own bodily needs. And as a theologian and a philosopher, he wrestled a lot with questions of what does it mean to be human? And he realized that he had grown up thinking that to be human is to create, is to make an impact on the world, is to do something, is to make something of yourself. It is to live in such a way that the world is changed because of the way that you live, because you created. God is a creator, and as those made in God's image, we are called to be creators. But in suffering his accident, he realized that his conception of what it meant to be human, that there wasn't much he could do. His ability to create or to make an impact on the world was hindered, that he needed others just to get through his daily rhythms. So was he less human now because of his inability to maybe contribute to society? So he started thinking, what does it mean to be human? And he says the first thing that we have to realize that we're human is that we are created. That our life, our existence comes from God, that we are created beings. And if we are created, that means that we are limited and dependent. That we find our life beyond ourselves, right? None of us here chose to be created. No one here said, I want to be a baby, and then was born. Your life came from someone else. And your life ultimately comes from God. And so if we are created, we are limited and dependent. And so what Shane came to realize is that in his life, being limited and dependent on others for his daily living, rather than that stealing his humanity, his learning to depend on others was actually a full expression of his humanity. So that when we are dependent upon others, when we receive from others, when we let others care for us, we are not being weak. We are actually being human. We are living out what it means to be created, to be limited, to be dependent. I think about this. I spent the last evening with my grandfather. My grandfather is 91 years old, and he's been battling cancer for the last few years. And my grandfather used to be this strong, tall, imposing man. And he was always one who gave and extended of himself. And in the last few years, as the cancer has impacted his body, he's become more stooped. He now walks with a walker, struggles to do daily tasks. He was always one who gave, but now he is dependent upon others for his own well-being. He had moved, in a sense, in the spiritual life from the realm of giving, and now he's in a place where he needs to receive care. And that's hard, and it's difficult. But there's also wisdom in that to receive care from others is not weakness, it's being human. And that if God meets us in a place of generosity, when we give, God also meets us when we receive care. Because if we are to give, That means there are people to receive. And if there are people who receive, there must be people who give. And so the rhythm of the spiritual life is to move between giving and receiving. And every moment in our lives, there are places where we need to give, and there are places where we need to receive. And as we move in this spiritual life, the question that is always before us in this reality is, where are you called to give? And where are you called to receive from others? I invite you to wrestle with those questions in the coming weeks. As we learn to live in the movements and the rhythms of the Spirit, to ask yourself, where in my life do I need to give as an act of faith, as a part of the spiritual life? And where in my life do I need to receive care? To even maybe ask others to extend to me, to care for me. That we learn those realities, we grow in humility, we grow in wisdom, and we ultimately grow in the Spirit. So brothers and sisters, may we be a people who give freely, generously, and may we be a people who also receive from one another and from God. Amen.